And we're live. Welcome to another episode of Modern Day Apocrypha, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that nice little countdown.
Yeah, thank you. We started at 12. I don't know where this is going to get cut, but we're starting from 12, and now we're here.
Here we are. Well, what's our topic today, Nick?
Today we're talking about addiction, and this was actually another fan-requested topic for us to cover. More specifically, is addiction a disease? And I'll be honest, this is one that I came into with a little bit of a bias, and I had my own preconceived ideas, and so it was, I think, a really healthy exercise to go through and actually give this some time to understand and think about and consider all the different perceptions. And I'm excited to talk about it with you today, Tony.
Yeah, same here. Before we jump into the topic, I do want to thank Chris for sending in this topic to us. And
Shout out to Chris. Much appreciated, sir. This is, like I said, it's very interesting.
Absolutely. And then piggybacking off of that, for anyone else who has a good idea of something they want us to cover or a question they'd like us to dig into and get our perspective on, hit us up, Instagram, Facebook. You can go on our website, and there's actually a little form you can fill out to send us an email. And if you do that, you get signed up for all our email updates that we haven't sent out yet, but we'll eventually maybe send something there. Who knows? But anyways, let us know what you think. And before we get into the episode, the other thing I do want to talk about, just so that everyone knows, Nick, why don't you tell us about some cool t-shirts we've got?
Yeah, so you may have heard the word on the street because it's big news.
The word on the street.
So for anybody who's watching this on YouTube, you may have noticed that some of the videos have been inconsistent. And what we've done, instead of just asking for our audience to help support the podcast and help us purchase some new camera equipment beyond just our iPhone that we're recording on, that gives us storage problems and also just randomly decides that it's done recording. We put together a new t-shirt design along with a fun promo video. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. It's lighthearted, but we wanted to give something back to our fans and our audience in return to helping us, make the podcast better and grow it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, cool. Well, now that we're done with announcements and thank yous and shout outs and advertisements, let's jump into addiction is a disease.
Or is it?
Is it? That's what I'm saying. Never mind. We're jumping into answering that. I slurred my speech. Don't judge me. Where do you want to start, Nick?
I think I kind of already touched on this at the intro, but I guess I'll just kind of state what my preconceived ideas were going into this, and maybe people can relate, maybe not. And I'm not trying to say that this is right or wrong or anything, but when I initially saw the topic come through as, like I said, it was a fan-suggested topic, my immediate reaction was like, well, of course it's not a disease because you put yourself in a position to get into this, habit or addiction. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I really had to reconsider my mindset. And so, this is what it did was it brought me back to the roots of why we wanted to have these conversations, because it's about that personal growth. And Tony and I don't claim to be experts on really any of these topics.
Yeah, not at all. Expert explorers and question askers maybe, but that would be the furthest I would be comfortable saying expert on anything.
Absolutely, and that's what it's about, is let's figure out what's right about what we think and what's wrong, and there's some area in between that too, which is just let's learn and have these conversations and dialogues with each other so that we can hear different ideas. And the reason I say all of that is because we want to bring our audience along with us while we expose our uncomfortable preconceived ideas and kind of put those out into the world, which is certainly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I think it's healthy. And I think that there are a lot of people in the world that are in the same shoes as us.
Yeah, I think so too, Nick. I think that's fantastic. I remember when this question came in for me, and I was like, well, I don't fucking know. Why are you asking me that? But as we went in, everywhere that I looked, like from a medical standpoint, it seemed like research says yes, that addiction is a disease.
Everybody.
But I wasn't satisfied with that. Like I'm like, why don't I like this, right? And I think as I dug in and got to the core of it, it's because specifically with addiction, we like to label people who have it. And I'm like, well, if addiction's just a disease, like, anything else, why do we feel the need to label people?
Meaning like it has this real strong negative connotation and implies a lack of self-control.
Or like, oh, he's got some celiac disease. Oh, fuck that guy. We don't do that with other shits, but ooh, he's an addict. Mm-hmm. Why is that? You know what I mean? If it's this, like you said, it challenges that preconceived notion of, oh yeah, these are just dumb people who do this shit to themselves. Well, not necessarily. If it's a disease, shit, maybe we shouldn't be so hard on people.
Yeah, so I think some of this is rooted in, or at least for myself, it's rooted in the fact that I have, first of all, we've talked about this in one of our previous episodes, but I intentionally try to avoid things that are habit forming.
Same.
Even down to coffee, which I've literally got a cup in my hand here. But it's, it's that conscious effort of like, right before the podcast, we were talking, and it's like, if you don't feel like you need a cup of coffee, like don't drink a cup of coffee, because it's just going to get your body into that caffeine addiction. And so that's just my general approach. I approach things like that with caution. And it's worked for me, so I advise other people to take the same approach, but that may not be the right approach for everyone. But I think the reason why I had that preconceived idea was because I have been in positions where I've experimented or tried different things that could be potentially addicting. And for whatever reason, it hasn't been habit forming. And I don't have anything to attribute to that scientifically.
Right.
And so therefore it's hard for me to be like, yeah, that's a medical disease, was addiction.
So because just to kind of recap and make sure I understand, I've done these things, I've gone in there, and I'm not an addict, so you must be stupid.
Well, I wouldn't say stupid, but I think that an honest answer would have been, you need better self-control.
Yeah.
And the more that I learned about this, the more I realized that isn't really the right mindset to take. At least that's the conclusion that I came to.
Sure. And so I think it's true probably for all of us, right? That it's easy to have these things, these thought processes or programs in our mind that make sense, but are really just based in ignorance.
That's right. Yep. And so just as an example, there was a mouse study that was tracking cocaine habits among mice. Sounds like a fun time for about half of the mice. And this gentleman had two videos, and one was a mouse in a box, and the other one was a mouse in the box. And one mouse was chilling, and the other mouse had the zoomies. Guess which one was high on cocaine?
Probably the one that was chilling, right?
Just the one that was chilling. Yeah, he was minding his own damn business. No, the one with the zoomies. He was damn near hitting the walls. But what was interesting about this study, and this is something that kind of led me on the road to changing my mindset here, both of these mice were genetically identical. They were clones of each other. There was a difference, however, in that this was back in the 50s. I think the geneticist had stated they transferred some mice from one lab, took half of those mice, again, all clones of each other, and shipped them to another lab. And over the past 50 years or so, even though they were genetically identical, there are some mutations that naturally occurred when they reproduced each other. I'm not sure how they continued cloning them, but they continued to be clones. But there were some genetic differences that developed because DNA isn't perfect.
Right.
And what happened was that one mutation out of 2.8 billion individual letter sequences. So if you're familiar with DNA, you've got, what is it, A, C, G, and T that make up a human genome anyway. And I think that it might vary by animals. But one mutation out of 2.8 billion in a mouse genome resulted in a new gene that regulates cocaine response. And it controlled the way that neurons in the brains reacted to the cocaine stimulus. And so from that perspective, the reaction that some mice had to cocaine was about 60 to 70% less of a response as compared to their other more or less genetic clones. You know, they were off by a couple genes here and there.
So just to make sure I make sense of this, so this all stemmed from the resistance to it, stemmed from the original mice who were exposed to cocaine, right?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. That's wild.
And so then, you know, over the years, they tested batch A and batch B, who were genetically identical, save for a few mutations that had occurred over the years.
Right.
And one set of mice had this gene that made them significantly less responsive to cocaine. And so therefore, because they had less of a response, they developed a significantly less likelihood of dependency. And they would just not give a fuck about the cocaine that was offered, positioned and offered. Yeah.
So, because I know if I'm thinking it, someone else is going to ask it. So you're saying the more drugs we do as a society, the less susceptible we'll be to them?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
So it wasn't necessarily a result of resistance like you think about somebody who smokes cigarettes eventually starts smoking a pack a day because they develop that resistance. And I think the same concept applies to most drugs, or at least I'm told they do. You know, like if you shoot up heroin, then, and you did like, I think they're measured in bags, I'm not sure, but I think they're bags of heroin, and you do one bag and then you start building up a resistance, and then you need 2, and then you need 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. And that's when that like really life-gripping addiction starts to develop. That's not necessarily this case. It's not that these mice just continue to be exposed to cocaine. It's that one set of mice developed a specific gene set that made them less responsive to cocaine.
So was that random, or do you think that was a result of the exposure?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I would hedge my bets on it was randomness.
Okay.
Because I don't know how many mice were included in the study, but it was like, I think he said like a batch of mice. So let's call it dozens or hundreds or maybe thousands.
Sure.
I'm not sure. But I would venture to say that it was more of like the random mutations more than anything else, because they're lab mice, and so they're going to be like kept alive to be able to reproduce artificially, you know? And so that survival of the fittest gene pool doesn't necessarily apply. I wouldn't think. It might.
Right.
But the takeaway that I had was that genes, so your genetic makeup, affect how can affect your response to habit-forming substances.
Got it. That's the takeaway of it. I was like, where are we going
so
with this,
I
Nick?
was working there.
Sorry, I jumped in there too quick, but
I
that's
think those were good
fantastic.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective on how, you know, and you don't know, right? When you're born as an infant, you don't have the understanding, and I don't even know if technology quite yet has the understanding to quick scan your DNA and be like, hey kid, here's the things you should watch out for. You know, here's the things that are your kryptonite.
Yeah. Stay away from heroin. Meth is fine.
God, I can't believe that was just a quote on our podcast. Please, nobody take that out of context, because it's not what we're meaning. Oh, that's funny though. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting thing for technology to for us to get to that point, to be like, hey, here are your genes, here's what you're good at, or maybe not what you're good at, but what your genes have a predisposition towards in a positive and negative fashion. And then maybe you can leverage the skin suit that you have from the beginning to, you know, save you some years of discovery.
Optimize your life or make of it what you want. But like, here's some good info for you to know.
Right.
Going into your teenage years, we'll say.
It's interesting. And, you know, I think they have some stuff out there, but I don't think it's as exhaustive as we're talking about right now.
Yeah. And yeah, so if we go back to the like genetics of addiction and what it means, what led me down to the path of, you know, diving into that research a little bit more was there have been multiple studies that I came across that suggested that addiction or the propensity for addiction is inherited. And, you know, I was pretty upfront with what my preconceived idea was going into this. But my initial thought was like, well, just because you're more likely, or you're likely to have addiction problems if your parents had addiction problems, I naturally just jumped to the conclusion that, well, maybe that's the environment that you were in. If your parents were drug users, then I would imagine that their child who was potentially exposed to that while you were growing up,
right,
would also be likely to develop the same types of habits.
Because then it's not genetic, it's just learned, observed behavior.
Right.
But what if the two aren't mutually exclusive?
Yeah, and so it could be, and I think that there certainly is something to that. Like, you're never going to struggle with addiction if you never have an opportunity to try addictive substances. So there is 100% an environmental play.
Right.
But I think therein lies part of the answer to why some people struggle with substance abuse and others can try something once, twice, a dozen times and walk away.
Well, I would say go back to the environmental thing. I know people will have some people will have a similar story to mine where, you know, I was homeschooled and grew up super conservative. And so there was literally no opportunity to experience anything in that realm. I remember being close to my 21st birthday and I had never drank. And I was like, shit, I've never done the underage drinking thing. Friends, go buy me some alcohol so we can, you know, sneak a couple of sips of Mike's Hard Lemonade in my parents' basement while they're gone. Like,
what a fucking rebel, man.
I know, right? But so there was no opportunity in that environment. But then as I've gone out into the world and lived my own life, you know, we've talked about on previous episodes, you know, different experiences with psychedelics and stuff like that. Like, I still experienced it, you know? So I think that environmental thing isn't perfect to paint the picture because it might not be 100% accurate.
Right. And there's certainly something to be said about the type of substances that people play with. I don't know this to be true, but like I'm told that heroin, meth, things like that are like a one and done type deal, or you try it 2 or 3 times and then you're just absolutely hooked. I was told the same thing about marijuana, and I can't say that that's the same case. So I don't really know what to believe, to be quite honest, but I think that there are certainly more addictive properties to some substances versus others.
Well, and I think there also has to go into, you know, mental state, right? So let's take addiction to a broader perspective than just substances. You know, I've had people tell me like, hey, well, I've got kids and stuff, and I know I can't touch any of the hard stuff, but man, I spend my life playing video games, like, because that's my way to decompress. And it's not just, oh, let me play a couple hours with my friends. It's nope, I get off work and I'm spending 6-8 hours.
Yeah, there are people with like pee bottles and they just get a bunch of Doritos and keep them at their computer desk and play World of Warcraft. Like,
or, you know, so what do you, I think that most healthy people, and I'm like mental health, like things in your life aren't stressing you, things aren't going crazy wrong, have a pretty good aversion to addictive things because it's an experience. And wow, I liked that experience. That was a good time. But I don't need, the experience was itself. I don't need to go like, oh my God, I need to go have this all the time because it was an experience. It's not, I'm escaping something.
Yeah, I think So maybe tell me if this is kind of along the same lines of what you're thinking.
Yeah.
I think it is. But, I read something this was by Jordan Peterson, and I'll paraphrase because I don't remember the exact excerpt from the book, but he was essentially saying that if you're able to get to the point in your life where your life has just inherent meaning, then it has value, and therefore you're much less likely to succumb to, say, alcoholism.
Sure.
Because you have something to lose. Like if you have a good life, then you're going to go more out of your way than somebody who doesn't have a good life that has a lot of meaning to preserve that value in life.
Yeah, that's another. I think it's the other side of the coin of what I was saying, right? Like, either A, I'm trying to preserve something, like you're saying, or B, I need to escape something.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like, and I think there's a middle ground in there too. That is, I just need to experience something.
The curiosity.
Yeah, and like a strong curiosity, and I'm not trying to escape something, but I also don't have anything I'm really trying to preserve either.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I guess just to kind of give some like examples for trying to escape something, it's like you just got out of a bad relationship or you lost a loved one or something like that, which are actually kind of the same thing. But
Hey.
but like people go get a 6-pack after a really long hard day or something really stressful. People go smoke cigarettes whenever they've had a stressful day. And I think those are the times where you're escaping something, you're using something as a crutch to get through a hard time. And that, in my mind, is not healthy. That doesn't make it right or wrong.
Right.
But I think it's kind of a slippery slope to be on.
Well, it can be, but I mean, like coming from somebody who has done those very things, and now I'm here, sometimes you got to do, like you said, it's the same risk of the coffee you just took a sip of, but on a smaller scale, okay? You know what? Do I need this now for today? If I've had like a shit day, you know what? Fuck it. Nick, I'm going to come over, I'm going to bring a bottle of wine, and we're going to shoot the shit, and we're going to get through this shit. Like, it's going to be good. Cool. I did that. I had the experience. I got through my stress. Maybe still not the best way to do it, but hey, I did what I needed to get by. Now, if you're in a constant state of stress that needs to become like a frequent thing, that's where I would try to check internally, personally, and go, is this an everyday thing? Like, what do I need to change in my life to not need this all the time?
Like you got to do self-reflection. Why am I always stressed?
Right.
And then that's where you have to change something. And I think that's where you get onto the path of like giving your life meaning, because you're putting your life back into a state that is sustainable, and then you're not having to look for escapes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If we take this back to the root of this conversation right now, is your mental state definitely plays a role, because that's kind of the underlying reason why some of us might be using or abusing certain substances to begin with.
Well, it's literally to change your state. This is all of these things change your state in one shape or another. Or, times that I would binge watch Netflix for like 12 hours on the weekend, both days, because I didn't want to accept or look at or deal with what was stressing in my life. So I needed to escape and live in a different reality. Doesn't mean Netflix is the devil. It's just, again, how you use these things. And it's interesting to me on how I'm kind of at this perspective where nothing is like really inherently, and don't take this too far, but nothing's inherently right or wrong. It's how you use it or the intention you put behind it.
Yeah.
So.
Absolutely. So just kind of recap this, because it's only been, 20 minutes, and I think we've covered a lot. But
yeah,
it starts to build the case for, in my mind, addiction is a disease, or at least it should be treated that way, because you've got mental states that impact the way that you respond to substances. And then you've got the genetics that impact the response that you have to certain substances. So it's like these two things, you can start seeing how this builds a case for it's a disease that can become out of control. And yes, there is like an initial point of exposure that I think we're all individually responsible for.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that the addiction itself is due to a lack of self-control. There's a lot more that plays into it.
Right. I would completely agree with that. And I think that initial point of whatever, of exposure to anything, I think humans by nature are inherently curious. And I think that's what's one of the most beautiful things about humanity is our need and desire to explore and experience. And so to completely demonize exploration, I just can't get behind that, you know? And so there's a version of responsibility there to say, yes, I am responsible for my own exploration. You know what? If I just try to go hiking out in the woods without any preparation or knowing what the hell is out there or how to get food if I didn't bring it with me or not to drink the stream water because it might not be clean and filtered like the water I'm drinking right now. Yeah, you know what? That's probably my own damn fault. And I can't use the excuse of, but I wanted to explore, man. You know, so do your research on whatever it is you're exploring, you know, because I think you can get addicted to anything in the right state.
I think so too. Like, I think, well, we already talked about video games. I was about to say, I think Xbox can be addictive.
Or even food, man. Like
food, absolutely.
Especially in this country. We have such easy access to food and like the excess of food. And you know what? I feel pretty damn good when I eat. Let me eat some more.
Yeah, and on that point, you know, consuming food gives you, or it makes your body release dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what happens when you do drugs. And it's all about, so I guess we're kind of getting into the science behind addiction. And again, I just want to really reinforce that I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about.
Hear, hear.
I'm not a scientist, nor am I an expert in this. But
quick, wait. You have a lab coat? We can put a lab coat on, then you can be a scientist.
No, but I know where we can get one.
Sorry, go on with your point. And no shade to actual scientists. I do really respect and appreciate the work you guys do.
So, you know, like a lot of addiction occurs because your body's releasing that dopamine. And dopamine at its core is your body's way of telling you what you need to go do to stay alive. It's very much a survival mechanism because you'll start seeing that the things that are just like really primitive, like food and sex, give you that dopamine release, and those are the things that people can get addicted to.
Right.
And so when you have drugs, for example, that release that dopamine hit, or maybe it's completing a quest on World of Warcraft, you get that dopamine response.
Well, it's not just dopamine too. It's like serotonin, oxytocin, like all of those that give you that version of a feel good.
Yes. They all come into play. I don't know that drugs release all of those chemicals. They might. I really just don't know. But I hear the dopamine response more.
That's the big one. Okay.
But like I think serotonin's what makes you feel connected to people. So you might get that from psychedelics, or I'm told that like it's a similar feeling with ecstasy.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that gives you those same hormone releases. I just don't know. But because certain substances or certain activities release that dopamine response, your body subconsciously recognizes that as good from a survival standpoint. And so then your body knows I can get a dopamine response, which throughout all of human history and evolution has been a requirement of survival, effectively.
Yeah.
So your body's like, go get that again, because that's helping us stay alive. And in today's world, where that's not really required to stay alive, it becomes a problem.
Well, yeah, if you think about that, like just what you're talking about, and with food, sometimes it might take 2-3 days to get a kill or actually get a meal. And then, hey, you know what? Biologically, let's reward you with a big hit of like, God, this feels good. This is rewarding. I need to do this again, because it's not just let me go to the fridge, let me go to McDonald's, let me go to the grocery store, let me go to whatever restaurant I want to go to. It was scarce, and so we needed these like big congratulations because you did something worth fucking moving shit forward. And now we just have access to so much with technology that it's like we're overstimulated.
I feel like we've just gotten to a point where as a society, we're so far past survival that our bodies haven't caught up.
That's a really good way to say where I was trying to go. Like we have all these survival responses still hardwired into our DNA, and this isn't for all of humanity yet, which is probably why we still have them. But for a lot of our like civilized culture, like whoever's probably listening in, a lot of this isn't needed like it once was. And so this puts us in a weird, having me ask a weird question. Do you think our bodies can and will evolve to reflect current lifestyle in society?
Yeah, but I think that we're on such an exponential curve that we're always going to be behind. I think that this has a whole nother conversation attached to it, but I think that we're on the trajectory to become, let's call it cyborgs or complete mechanical replacements of bodies. Like I think that there is a point in the distant future where we're able to, we've already got all of the human genomes sequenced. We're starting to map out all of the individual neurons and such in the brain. And I think that there is a point where we'll come to where we're able to, let's say, download a consciousness and upload it into a mechanical form.
It's interesting.
And at that point, I think that's when our bodies no longer have to try to keep up with our technological advancements. But when you think about, like, if I go back to your question, think about like in the Middle Ages, let's call it the 12 to 1500s. That's from a biological and evolutionary standpoint, that is not long ago at all. I mean,
that's really true.
A very small amount of time. And those people back in those times, the vast majority of them survived by farming. And so if you had a bad winter, you didn't have food, or hunting. And so either way, it's still that more like primitive response. And so all of this was still necessary, probably even all the way up through maybe even 1900. In the 1800s, it's not like we had Walmart down the road still. And so we're talking, 150 years ago that things have changed so drastically.
So what if, how do I play this out? So what if, let's say, humanity does evolve to the point where we don't have these primitive survival responses and some weird catastrophic event happens that our civilization as we know it ceases to exist? Will those survival responses that have gotten us this far, if they're lost, how do we continue? So like we see ruins of crazy civilizations that are just lost and we don't understand how they got there, where they came from. And what if we've done this before and those survival responses that maybe aren't serving us in our day-to-day life today maybe serves the species as a whole in a dystopian future?
So your question is, like, are we losing the things that make us able to survive?
If we were to evolve, and our bodies would lose these responses that we determined aren't as necessary as they were just a couple hundred years ago, and then something happens that makes them now
like
needed again. But those responses are gone. Do we survive, and like how long would it take to like evolve them back, and would we make it through that transition?
I think it all depends on like what time that happens, because I think if you get to the point in the science fiction future that I had kind of painted where like we're
cyborgs and all that,
cyborgs or complete robotic or mechanical beings that have whatever consciousness is uploaded into them, then I think at that point, like, we've got the technological advancements to say, okay, trigger these genes. And then it just puts you back into whatever state. It's all configurable, you know? Right now, I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that'll be the case for
a long time. Yeah, it was just an interesting thought since we were talking about it.
But I think that the potential's there. But
how'd we get here?
So one of the questions that I have is kind of along the same vein that we've been talking about like the responsiveness of human biology.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be curious to see, I don't know, did you come across any information on like humans' history with addiction? Like, did we struggle with addiction in the BC era?
That's interesting.
Or BCE as it's called now.
Yeah. I wonder if addiction is a disease of thriving.
Yeah, like so kind of along this, I think this is where you're going with this. The way that I thought about it was, if you are in a situation where you're having to survive and you're not having all this luxury time where you can sit on a couch and slump over from a nice shot of heroin, like, would you develop those addiction forming habits? Or would you be in a position where it's like, let's say you smoked heroin, and let's say it's, like 2000 years ago, and you smoked heroin and you had that experience, and it's like, whoa, okay, but now I got to go kill an elk.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, partially because, I haven't lived in this body in that time.
Yeah.
And like, that's an interesting thought. And so, yeah, I wonder if addiction is kind of and maybe someone listening in can chime in and give us a better perspective, but I wonder if it is a result of having access to excess. And so then rewinding, looking back through at least what we know of history, it would seem like those who would have access to addiction would only be, the extremely wealthy, which the further back you go, the less of those there are.
So I'll read an excerpt, and then I'll scroll back up and let everybody know where I'm reading from. But I'm just doing a quick search right now, and there's an excerpt here that says abnormal patterns of substance use have been described since antiquity, at least since Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, which was precipitated by years of heavy drinking. Aristotle recorded the effects of alcohol withdrawal and warned that drinking during pregnancy could be injurious. And so it looks like there's some history there, but it's interesting that it only goes back to 323 BC when we've got, documented writings from thousands of years before zero.
Yeah, but what if...
hold on, I'm sorry, before we get too far away. This was from, I actually don't know the website. I'm trying to find, it's an acronym. U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health. So it's ncbi.gov. There's some other things in there, but...
Cool. Well, what if, writings haven't been preserved, right? Or at least the farther you go on, the harder it is to preserve that shit. And so what if maybe it was written about in those times that you're talking about, but it just wasn't as culturally important, and so the effort to preserve those type of writings, or even to write them down in the first place, that effort wasn't there, but it might have been common knowledge.
And if that's the case, that's an interesting theory, because that kind of backs up one of my previous comments, which is, like, if you had one of those experiences, like, people like to explore, you mentioned that, like, we're naturally curious. And so, like, we know that people smoke tobacco. We know that people have smoked marijuana for years. And so if you came across, I guess it's poppy. I don't know how you smoke heroin, but people smoke heroin. So if you came across, let's just call it a poppy plant.
I think it's flowers, like the poppy plant. Yeah.
Okay. So let's say, I don't know how all this works, but let's just, for argument's sake, say that you came across a poppy field and you smoked it because you were curious. And then you got that, like, heroin high. And then it was like, okay, maybe you did form an addiction, but it was so few people that actually got addicted to it because people had to go back out and, like, go find fucking food.
Right.
That they just break their addiction because there's never an opportunity to develop a habit from it.
Well, and a lot of these things were used in, like, spiritual practices for, like, transcendental states.
Yeah.
Transcendental states.
The oracle in Delphi, Greece, or Delphi, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, that she was like, if anybody's seen, what's the movie? 300?
Yeah.
They go to the oracle, right? And it turns out that there are fissures, cracks in the earth that released a mixture of gases that were coming out. And the oracle was just getting high off her fucking cake.
Yep.
She's in there just tripping balls. And no wonder she's talking to the gods and like letting you know what's going to happen and having visions.
Right. But my mind goes, well, it's not past the point of possibility to be like, that was just something that helped them cross the veil. Now, they could just be tripping balls and it's all in your mind. But, you know, just kind of like people have similar type experiences with mushrooms. I don't think we talked about this before, or other psychedelics. It's my perspective that they're connecting with something that we don't have in our normal physical 3D reality.
Yeah, and it's like a web of consciousness.
Right.
Is the way that you've described it. And I think that's interesting. Like, I think that there's definitely room for that to be the case. And I think it's possible. I think, like, when it comes to psychedelics or, like, those really mind-altering, more like mental states as opposed to physical states, I think that, like, I consider how dreams work, and maybe dreams are tapping into the same consciousness.
Sure.
I'm not sure. But I think that there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, I could get behind that. But it's interesting to see, though, like going back to the convo here, alcohol, in my mind, I've never had an experience that puts me in any type of that kind of a state with alcohol. And so since what you say, like 300, they've had alcohol and known like, hey, y'all, this might not be the greatest thing if you're pregnant or, you know, in excess. So it's interesting to see that we have substances that are known as pretty much harmful. You know, and I still have a drink here and there. Like, I'm not condemning anybody who drinks.
Tony, we all know that like, you're crushing 12 packs every day.
Jeez, no. But
only 6 packs.
That's been a thing for the past couple thousand years that's been around for humanity, and we still use it. So there has to be a version of helpfulness or something that it provides for us. Otherwise, you would assume if it was completely toxic, we would have found a way to kind of like eradicate it or say fuck off.
That's interesting. Yeah, so why hasn't that happened? Well, I guess in alcohol's case, it was safer to drink alcohol in antiquity than it was to drink water because we didn't understand that. Well, think about like the cholera outbreak that was going on in, I think it was London. And like one of the wells was contaminated and people were just fucking dying left and right. And they're just trying to drink some water.
So that goes back to the potential of we needed this for survival, and we knew the health benefits of fermentation. Because like, you know, like bread and stuff like that, like how they used to make like old school like sourdough bread, it's all just through fermentation. And that was a way to preserve things and keep it safe and healthy. And now it makes tasty shit and we love it. But the excess of it we may have outlived the deep necessity for it.
Yeah. Yep. I think so.
Huh.
I think you're spot on.
Interesting.
I'll tell you another thought that came across my mind when I was looking into this, and somebody asked the question, if addiction isn't a disease, so if we don't consider addiction a disease, then why do we consider diabetes a disease? And that was honestly the question that just completely threw me over the fence. And I was like, fucking checkmate, baby. Like, you got me. Because, like, specifically with, I think it's type 2 diabetes that is induced by, like, consuming too much food and sugar and stuff like that. That's all, well, I shouldn't say all. Like, I think that you might also have a genetic predisposition for it. But let's call it self-induced. In the same way that, you know, like a drug-induced addiction would be. Right. Like you try drugs and you continue doing drugs and then you have an addiction. And before I dove into this topic, I would have said, yeah, that's not a disease. Like you just did too many fucking drugs. Lay off, bro. And you know, part of that is true. Like, just fucking slow down, slow your roll.
Right.
But no, like the addiction itself, if you consider that not a disease, then why would you consider diabetes a disease when you can just not eat that next donut? Like, and I know I'm grossly oversimplifying all of this,
Right.
but it's the point is there, you know?
Well, and I think it's also like if you go back to, we talked about environmental stuff. A lot of people just don't have a good education on food and realize that all of the processed bullshit that our grocery stores and fast food restaurants are full of is not a great staple for your diet. Now, having it once in a while it's not going to kill you. It's not going to give you diabetes. You're going to be just fine. But when that's the foundation of your diet, and you know what? I have a donut every morning for my breakfast, or oatmeal chock full of sugar and all this stuff. Like, the American diet's not great and leads to things like diabetes and God knows what else.
Diabetes.
Good old Wilford
Yeah, that's
Brimley.
right. And along those same lines, like I think it goes beyond sugar. Like you also see the other health effects like cardiac issues because it's so convenient to increase a shelf life by just racking up the sodium and salt levels because that is a natural preservative. That's why, you know, mummies from Egypt were, I don't know if they're stuffed with salt. I don't know how it all worked, but they use salt to preserve the body.
Yeah.
And look how long it lasts. Like, that's nuts. So there's obviously real strong value in that. And that's also why salt was so expensive back in the like Columbian era, because it was a good preservative. And so it's got a use. But if all we're doing is eating those canned goods and the food that has that long shelf life from the grocery store because it's cheap
And convenient.
then you're going to have problems arise from that.
Right. And it might not show up in a week, might not show up in a year, but 10 years. And then you're like, man.
So all of this is why I think we've talked about this before. This is what got me interested in like growing my own food because I want to know what's in it. If I can produce it fresh here in front of me in my backyard, then I just trust it better. I feel I haven't like really dove into this, but it seems like a better source of food that doesn't have artificially high sodium or unnatural sweeteners.
Do you use pesticides and stuff?
No.
Well, that's another thing that's not all
Right.
over your veggies that you're growing. And
Yeah, and so that's kind of the idea. And then same with, I just recently got into hunting this past weekend. And so that's been pretty fun.
get anything yet?
But yeah, I got a buck.
Hey,
So
congrats,
that's
man.
exciting. I appreciate it. But what I like about that is that the meat that I get isn't being preserved with salt. It's being vacuum sealed and freeze dried. And it's also much leaner than beef. And so you don't have, there's nothing wrong with fats. Like for anybody who's actually like in a survival situation, go
Fat's
get like,
fantastic.
all the fat that you can
Yeah.
because that's what keeps you alive and going. But in today's world where we get fats from so many other sources of food, you can really cut out a lot of that. And it's just healthier. And that's at its core what I find interesting and appealing to it.
Yeah, it's just so interesting on how, at least I felt I've been, prior to my exploration of asking these types of questions, I feel like culture has conditioned us to be like, this is the best society in the world we've ever had. In some aspects we have, but
It's the most convenient society we've ever had.
yeah, but that convenience, it's like we don't add the education to it.
Yeah, and so along those lines of education, I think that's where we as people get stuck. And this is where like addiction can arise from our genetics and who we are. Because think about like sugars and fats. We just said that fats are what help you survive in a survival situation.
Right.
And so our bodies are just naturally going to gravitate towards those sweet, calorie-dense foods because when we were becoming humans, you had to have those calorie-dense foods to survive. And
there wasn't easy access to them. So when we did have them, nope, I'm giving this dopamine right now, gorge. Eat as much as you can because you don't know when this is coming. And that hardwired system in there goes,
that's right.
More,
And you're going to
more.
burn it off.
Yep.
And so, like, as a society, we've almost just played right into that. We'll call it a weakness. It's not really a weakness, but it's an exploitation of our human genome.
Yeah.
To be susceptible to being addicted to fatty foods and things like this. So all of this plays into the addiction, and why we get addicted to substances, whether it's food or drugs.
Well, and then you add the nefarious thought to it, because we're good at adding those. It's like, people have to know this shit. Oh, okay, cool. Well, people love donuts. All right, well, let's get the donut recipe right so that it has the right salt, fat, whatever content in it that they'll fly off the shelves. Not thinking about what that's doing to people's health. Oh, this is so good, I need 15 more. But it's lining my pockets. And so I feel like there's so many things, and even, we mentioned like addiction to like video games and like even social media, stuff like that. Hey, what are these responses that is naturally in the human psyche to trigger to keep getting more money? And at some point, like, we're just disrespecting ourselves as humans.
Yeah, like, I think that there is responsibility on all of us.
Yeah.
One, on us as consumers to be educated and be in control of that and understand what is potentially out there. But then also as producers, like in your donut example, like, I think there's a responsibility on that person. Now, the counter to that, though, is, well, people want fucking donuts.
Sure.
Like, and there's nothing wrong with having a fucking donut from time to time. And so,
but exploiting the lack of understanding behind it.
I have a hard time saying that people are intentionally exploiting
intentionally or unintentionally. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I have to believe that there's some people out there intentionally doing it.
I think that there are, and maybe donuts isn't the best example of that.
Right.
But like
of course, everyone isn't.
But like the Twitter and Facebook notifications, or maybe it was Apple that was designing notifications to cause you to be addicted to your phone and always look at it, and it's always consuming your attention. Mm-hmm. Like, that's deliberate.
Yep. So there's definitely a spectrum there, and I'm not, trying to call anybody out. I'm just trying to put it in the light and say, hey, we need to do better as a society. Here's some things we need to fix.
Shout out to Shipley's Donuts, by the way. I just got a craving for some blueberry cake donuts, because damn, those are good.
Well, and to balance out that, I'm not the biggest Shipley's fan.
Are you not?
Everyone's been like, oh my God, you got to have Shipley's. And I'm like, oh, they're not that great,
bro.
And I keep trying them, and everyone's like, oh, you just haven't.
No, that's all right. You're giving it a few shots. I love their blueberry cake donuts specifically. I don't know that I'm a big Shipley's fan, but I am a big Shipley's blueberry cake donut fan.
You know a good donut discussion can't go without a donut shout out.
Yeah, that's right. Tell us where you get your favorite donuts.
Hell yeah. I get I think probably the best in town. Have you had Five Daughters donuts?
I have. Yeah, those are pretty damn good. Is that Nashville local? I
think it is. I could be wrong on that, but they do a lot of things well. But the thing that they've like known for is their cronut, which is like a croissant donut that has like all these layers of like buttery croissant, and then it's dunked in sugar and it's buttery and
exploitation at its finest.
There it is. Yes, exploitation at its finest. And I still allow myself to be exploited from time to time. So again, to round out this conversation, I'm not trying to demonize, and I don't think speak for both of us, we're not trying to demonize fun, good, tasty things, or even, altered experiences. But I think I'd like to, just challenge everybody who's listening to take awareness with those things and try to maybe add balance to all of those things, so we don't end up in these states where we're stuck needing whatever.
So along those lines, I think that part of the education is certainly happening. Like, we've seen like Intervention become a big hit show, and I don't know if they're still running, but that was real popular a few years ago. And I'm seeing a lot of education or promotional materials about like addiction hotlines and different cities or counties and states are setting up these hotlines to help people who are struggling with addiction, because it's certainly a problem. And I think it's a problem in the more developed societies. And so I think it's cool. I think it's good that as a whole, we're all coming in and recognizing this as a problem and trying to help each other out, because it does go back to addiction, and then, or it does go back to education, excuse me. And then even though you've been educated about it, some of us still succumb to these problems, and we've all made mistakes. And just because somebody's made a mistake and fallen into this trap doesn't mean that their life should be ruined. Like
or that they should be branded.
Or that they should be branded, exactly. And so I think that's where, regardless of where somebody falls on the line of is addiction a disease or not,
yeah,
I think giving it that recognition that it is a disease can help, because that helps us put more of a priority on it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and I think it helps take some of the stigma away from it too, as
Yeah.
opposed to, oh, there's just some dumb people who don't know how to control themselves. Well, it's bigger than that, right? Whether it be, the environmental stuff that someone grew up with or was exposed to that wired them a certain way, whether it was their genetics that wired them a certain way, whether it's the constant stress they live in that they don't know a different way how to get out of, and that caused it. Like, people are still people, and they're not less than because they're struggling or going through something.
And it also, like, you don't know somebody's history. Like you said, people are going through things, but consider somebody who was abused as a child, and then they're looking for an escape, and that escape might come much, much, much earlier in life than the majority of the population is used to. And so if you've been exposed to some substances when you were, say, 10 years old, which is, that happens.
Yeah.
And that can really change your entire outlook as a person. And so I think I'm too quick to judge all the time in way too many instances.
Same.
Tony's pointing to himself. I think I might venture to say all of us, but I'll say a lot of us are, to be safe, quick to judge. And I think if we just take a moment to not jump to those conclusions like I do, and try to strive for a little more tolerance and a little more openness and understanding, and maybe have a conversation with some people, I think it'd go a long way.
Definitely. Well, I think before we wrap this one up, do you have anything else before I...
Nope, I was just about to ask you if you had anything else,
cool.
So that was well timed.
Hey, we're on the same page. It only took us, 15 episodes? I think since we're talking about this, if you are somebody listening in and like you're resonating with a lot of this stuff, like, hey, you know what, maybe I am dealing with addiction, reach out. I mean, it doesn't take, like Nick mentioned, a bunch of stuff online. I've not done enough research prior to this moment to confidently say, here's where you should go, but reach out to a friend, reach out, do your own research. But
look up a hotline. We
Exactly.
talked about that. I see them all the time. I'm not sure that they're everywhere, but there's a good chance that you can find one.
Exactly. Yeah. And like, reach out, get some help, and, change your state and enjoy the thriving that humanity has access to now.
Absolutely. Hey, we appreciate everybody coming along with us on this topic and this conversation. And like I said, it was one where I've flipped from one position to another, and that's exactly why I want to have these conversations. And I'll say some dumb things during the conversation that may be insensitive, but it's all about trying to grow and be open. And I think saying dumb things sometimes get your hand slapped by other people, and they tell you a different perspective, and that helps us all shape ourselves into being a more well-rounded individual. And that's what this is all about.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Well, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch y'all next week.
Yeah, and before we close, check out moderndayapocrypha.com and check out our new merch. I know that we've already hit this at the start, but we'd love to get a new camera for everybody else, and anybody who's watching this on YouTube would probably agree, because some of those goofy-ass photos that we've put up in lieu of a complete video could probably use some work.
What Nick is really saying is he has some really nice nose hairs he'd like to show off from a better quality camera.
That's right. Bingo. Now I gotta go cut those out. Peace out, y'all.
See you guys.